In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right. Thank you, patrons, for coming in and supporting Sublation. Your support is what keeps us going. We've got Chris Cutrone with us today to follow up on my announcement of the proto party. Let's see. I'm not seeing anybody watching at the moment, but we'll give it a moment to see if they jump in. Let's see if it's even live. Oh, I see the problem. Yeah. The problem was that I set it for 11 hours from now rather than right now because I put it for 10:20 p.m. rather than 10:20 a.m. So got to keep my eye on that. But yeah, people are here. No, people are joining in. It just took a second longer because of that. So anyway, Chris Cutrone's here. We're going to talk about the proto party. Chris, I want to give you the opportunity to begin with some critiques because I know that you're the last track coach. Marxist.
I mean, I can explain something in terms of the statement that you read out from 2016. Mm-hmm. So actually in 2015, I had a kind of epiphany. I made a New Year's resolution for myself that I was going to start a socialist party. And, it was looking ahead to the inevitability of Hillary. And I thought Hillary would be running against whomever, generic Republican. So I didn't see Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump coming at all. I was sort of shocked by both of them because they're blasts from the past, from the 80s, from my adolescence. And I thought, these are the last people I would imagine to ever run for president, actually. And so that took some of the wind out of the sails. But nonetheless, we proceeded with it. And so me and some people in Platypus, but also some other people not in Platypus, started the campaign for a socialist party, and we formulated that set of 11 theses. It's like the 11 theses on Feuerbach. The point is to change it. Because I had the experience both before I started Platypus and after, like during Platypus, that I had many students who were excited by the ideas they were learning in the classroom about Marxism. But didn't want to just do what Platypus does, which is a kind of education project, but wanted to do something more activist-y. Mm-hmm. And I also thought at that time that there might be a closing window of opportunity to take advantage of the activist experience of the baby boomers, of the new left generation. People like Adolf Reed, who had experience organizing, but that experience wasn't being put to any good use anymore. It was experience from the 60s and 70s, some experience from the 80s as well. But really, Doug, you and I talk about the sort of desert that we were in the 80s and 90s, where there were protest demos, but, there might be like petition campaigns, like you worked for a PIRG, a public interest research group, or what is it?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And they had Mass PIRG when I was at Hampshire, and you had OSPIRG, and right. Mm-hmm. And so, they did stuff like that, but there wasn't actually any organizing of the working class going on. And this is the period that's notorious for the decline in union membership in the working class. But it's really the decline overall. I mean, it's the neoliberal era, right? And so the decline in civil society, we might say. Now, when we say civil society, we immediately sound like, I don't know what, humanitarian military interventionists or something. We're going to bomb the Serbs in order to protect civil society in Bosnia or something like that. But NGOs, I feel like in the time that we've lived, something else has come up. So there's been a kind of privatization. The 1,000 Points of Light, that was a George Herbert Walker Bush idea, which was that the government would actually encourage and support religious organizations to sort of take up the slack in civil society. The idea is that government shouldn't do it, government can't do it, society has to do it, And maybe the best that the government can do is make it easier for civil society to do it, right? And so this is kind of tainted, right, with a kind of association with neoliberalism, privatization. And I feel like, the left, insofar as it's been following progressive capitalist politics for a long time, it's been in this kind of rearguard action against neoliberalism from the 70s onwards, but certainly starting in the 80s after Thatcher and Reagan were elected. So to defend the existing institutions like labor unions that are civil society institutions, but also to defend government programs against privatization, no matter how rotten the public institutions turn out to be. Right? Because obviously this privatization, I mean, Ashley, you were talking about imposed from above versus coming from below. Well, neoliberalism looks like, like the Naomi Klein thesis is that it's imposed from above, but no, neoliberalism really came up from below, meaning they couldn't have done what they did without at least the passive and often the active support of people rebelling against these government institutions, including starting in the 60s. Indeed, that's when it started, right? And that's why, like, someone like Adolf Fried, like, the long historical view is that those new social movements were actually the active agencies of neoliberalization.
Right.
And they have
the free speech movement.
Right. So it's like, so that's just to clear the air about civil society for a second there. But now we live in this bizarre wasteland. But maybe the wasteland isn't so recent. Maybe in the mid 20th century, like to link back up with the 60s generation, what they were rebelling against. So Doug, I had you read a few things, like two things from, actually three things. So two by Otto Kirchheimer, who was a member of the Frankfurt School, and then one by a kind of seemingly liberal, I don't know much about him, Sigmund Neumann, the Party of Democratic Integration, probably a Cold War liberal of some kind. I don't think related to Franz Neumann, who worked with Kirchheimer in the Frankfurt School on behemoth on Nazism and other things, on mostly like legal questions of like capitalism, late capitalism. So they were writing in the 50s and 60s, and they were writing about, or the one Kirchheimer I sent you was from 1941, right? Now, in an era when they're dealing with the fact that the old kind of political parties, including especially the socialist parties, have been replaced by like mass parties, so not class parties, but mass parties that were actually filling in for, but also meant to defeat class struggle. So the decline of class struggle, class parties were replaced by mass parties. Then they were institutionalized, but they had a funny kind of quality that they kind of lacked substance. And I think that one of the one Kirchheimer essay from 1941 talks about the changing status of private property and the changing status of representative democracy, right? And that when representative democracy was based on private property, as opposed to this more like corporate, quasi-state sponsored property forms, they had a different character. So it's basically the end of the old liberal system. So the 20th century was the end of the old liberal system. Again, for us today, and especially dealing with younger people, they hear liberalism, they think neoliberalism, and they think, oh no, that's the dominant thing. That's the thing that we've had for the last 50 years. We've had liberalism, and we're discontented with that. We want to get rid of that. So there's a kind of spontaneous move towards statism. But the point, actually, was that the statism of the 20th century did have a hollow character, meaning it was about how capitalism had destroyed the old bourgeois civil society that was still in effect in the 19th century, and that was actually the basis for the working class movement. In other words, Marx and Engels and the old style Marxists, like Lenin, they just assume certain things about the self-organization of people in bourgeois society, first and foremost the working class, that increasingly ceased to be the case in the 20th century. So a lot of what we think of as very recent is actually very old. Now, my thought figure about these things is, can we try to turn a liability into an asset? Meaning, because it's such a wasteland, because it's so empty, that's a whole field of opportunity, you know? But it's really about activism. So it's not about electoralism. Like, I think people hear party, like in the United States, registering as a political party means that you're running for an election. And I think that there's probably a similar phenomenon in Europe. So party means official recognition as qualifying for elected office, qualifying to be on the ballot, right? So you'll hear DSA Jacobin people say, well, the parties are just a ballot line, and so they don't really have any substance. And it doesn't matter whether we run on a ballot line or not, right? We're doing our own thing. And it's like, okay, well, that's true, but there was actually an older notion of a party, actually, both in the liberal conception, liberal era of capitalism, late 19th century, and in the socialist conception, which was meant to be about connecting up parliamentary or electoral representatives and officials with civil social organizations. So the Labor Party has its base in the Trades Union Congress, the TUC. That is its ostensible base. It has an official organizational base, very different from the Democrats, because the Democrats, the unions, support the Democrats the way any NGO supports the Democrats. Do you remember when Bernie called the establishment? He said Planned Parenthood, National Organization of Women, Human Rights Campaign, NAACP. They're the establishment that's trying to stop him. He said that. He said, I'm running against the establishment. You want to know who they are? It's all these identity-oriented NGOs.
When did he say that exactly?
In the 2016 campaign, when he was running against Hillary. Yeah, of course. Yeah, he's not doing, no, he didn't do that in 2020, not at all. No, this is why. So Doug, like once Bernie and Trump arrived on the scene, I was like, well, either the kids are right and we're living in a virtual reality, and it's a personal virtual reality, namely a personal nightmare, or I got to pay attention to these things. So I started paying attention to the Bernie campaign and to the Trump campaign, both very closely, but just looking at it as capitalist politics. I never had any illusions that Bernie was anything but that, you know, and that they were both basically motivated by disappointment with Obama. You know, that they were both basically dissident Obama-isms, right? And so both were basically neoliberal. You know, Bernie's whole political career is in the era of neoliberalism, like Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, you know, and even his constituency is like a middle class. It's a very neoliberal middle class constituency. It's not a working class constituency, right? So it's like, you know, any of these progressive districts in the United States, or any of these kind of safe Labour Party seats in the UK, right? Which is why the whole, in the UK, the elections have been about the North, the kind of oscillation between the Tories and Labour, the working class, right? And populism and all this crap. So things have become complicated since I first had this idea, right? Meaning I didn't see populism coming in 2015. I really didn't. I saw sclerosis of the parties. I saw a kind of zombie capitalist politics. I didn't see, I guess I should have, but I didn't see the political crisis manifesting. So I thought it would be a relatively peace and quiet era in which we could start to build a socialist party that we would then have for the future. Well, now, so after almost 10 years, right, we've gone through this Trump era, we've gone through Brexit, Bernie, Corbyn, Syriza, everything, right? And so now, full circle. Okay, we tried that. Ready to go back to socialism again, kids? Right? But again, what does it mean? It doesn't mean what Corbyn and Sanders offered or what Syriza offered. It doesn't. It's more back to the Occupy and the squares, that stuff. You know, remember the Great Recession? Remember when there was some inkling of something like, okay, the government's not going to do it, we have to do it for ourselves? It's treacherous. It is the product of neoliberalization, but it's also the product of a longer-term hollowing out of politics and a kind of rise of technocracy, the administrative state. The administrative state's not new. It's old. Woodrow Wilson goes all the way back to the progressive era. And neoliberalism didn't reverse the administrative state. It did not. It just gave it a new like ideology and some changes in policy. And privatization, really wasn't privatization. It was just government contracts, right? It's not like, so I had students who participated in the No Child Left Behind education program of George W. Bush. And, they can testify to the fact that it was a total shit show and that it was basically a take the money and run operation by some hucksters, right? But in the meantime, some teachers were hired and some kids were educated. And, that's capitalism. It is a take the money and run huckster operation, but in the meantime, things actually get done. So, again, putting aside the specter of neoliberalism, which is in the rear view now, and right, so we can't do, I feel like the Bernie era, the DSA, the Jacobin, especially with Trump, they're like, oh, well, the right got its chance, so now it's our chance. Like, we're supposed to wield this state for our purposes instead of them who wield it for their purposes. Well, no, the older socialist idea was that it's the capitalist state, it's the politics of the capitalist state, it's not about us at all. It's not about socialists or socialism. It's not even about the working class. It isn't. The working class is never really an agent in the capitalist state. It's a subordinated, it can be subordinated through a kind of bureaucracy, through a labor bureaucracy, for example. Through, like, if you think about, like, when my students, some of them joined leftist organizations, some of them became union activists, which meant joining staff at unions, meaning they joined the labor bureaucracy.
Yeah.
That's what it means. Well, I also say, rather controversially, the labor unions as they exist are not fit for purpose anymore. The labor movement really does need to be rebuilt from below again. But there's the wasteland is the opportunity.
Can I interject here and say the reason why I was wanting to start this now, and the reason I made the announcement today, was because I spent many hours on Twitter and I was watching how the political campaigns were operating through that medium. Yeah, and it had sunk to this level of calling each other weird, and Kamala Harris's sex life, and it was so both empty of content, and also I saw so many people who I think of as being intelligent, smart people who are talented. Like Rob Reiner would be an example. Obviously, he's been
Trump deranged syndrome.
Yeah, for a while. But nonetheless, I admire Rob Reiner. And Timothy Morton would be someone else that I admire, who I saw becoming just, sub 2016 liberal in this moment. And I thought, if you take one step back, if you don't engage with it on its own level, which I was doing sometimes, or at least trying to critique these critiques, which was a way of engaging it on its own level. And if you take a step back, you can point out how hollow and disconnected and irrelevant this is to almost everyone's life. That this is simply a game of reputation management and distraction. And I thought, well, a political party that could step forward and say, we're not doing this. This is something we're going to do something else. Might be viable right now. It may be this. You thought the populism wouldn't arise. Well, the populist movement may be ending.
Seems like it.
Yeah, and it even if Trump wins.
No, because it will just be an institutionalization of Trumpism at the level of policy. Meaning, Trump, he just needed to get votes. That's all any capitalist politician needs. And the only reason that they call it populism is that he's working outside the traditional vote-getting mechanisms of the parties. So when he ran in the primaries in 2016, like Bernie, he was accused of not being a true party member because he was getting too many independent votes. He wasn't winning the registered Republican vote, same way Bernie wasn't winning the registered Democrat vote. He was winning primaries or doing well in primaries mostly based on new voters, independent voters. And so both parties used that to disqualify them. And because they were bringing in new voters, they were called populists. Populist just means they are activating people who otherwise wouldn't vote, and that the parties don't rely on to be elected, and that they don't want to rely on to be elected, meaning neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted the new voters. Right? And that's where populism, and it's like, yeah, that is a problem only for the marketing people at the Democratic and Republican parties. That's not like a real thing. Like populism, no. It's not a real thing. And so what it is just, because look, there is a crisis politically. Neoliberalism has been in crisis. There has been need for policy changes, which can happen without electoral changes, but can also happen through electoral changes. And it's only a mark of how ossified the parties are that they've been so resistant to even trying to reach out of their traditional electorates. Right? So anyway, I always knew it wasn't going to be about elections. Right? I always knew it was about the working class. I mean, Ashley, you were talking about this, about the from below and your brother as an example. What does socialism even mean? I always have my family in mind. And it's one of these funny things, because they know I'm a Marxist and I talk to my family and they're pretty conservative. And, their basic attitude is, well, if socialism meant what you say it means, then I would support it. But that's not what it means. And so that's why I don't support it. It's like Tucker Carlson would say that. He would have these socialists on. Remember when Tucker Carlson was going to have me on? And, so he had all these sort of eccentric leftists. At that time, Cornel West counted as one of them. And he would just ritually say, I love what you're saying, and if that's what socialism meant, I'd be a socialist. But no, that's not really what it means. And so I'm not. Right? And so I know, right? And, I would say early in Platypus, like the communist label is just whatever. That's just appâter la bourgeoisie. That's just like shock the bourgeoisie. That's like make your parents freak out. You say you're a communist, right? That's just whatever, right? But even socialist, like, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago, I was like, yeah, socialist sounds a little bit too authoritarian, sounds a little bit too collectivistic, sounds a little bit too statist. I don't know if I would call myself a socialist, right? Ashley?
Libertarian socialist.
I'm talking and I'm muted. That's why I don't call myself a socialist for exactly those reasons.
No, we need to reclaim it. We really need to reclaim it. Meaning, do we care about society? Yes, then we are socialists. It's a very simple proposition.
Is there a word that is emerging to replace it? Is the question I have. Is there some idea that's coming up from society that could replace the term socialism? I don't see it, so I'm not going to change. But if there's some other word, like brat or something that we could be
I was going to say, like, I don't know, like what is new in our time? Pepe the Frog?
No, not really. I mean,
not new anymore, but I'm just thinking what has been new in terms of political identity, the alt-right.
And that's not even that new. It really goes back to the 60s, I think, the new right and the alt-right.
Well, the new right is different from the alt-right. So the alt-right, I feel like it's from the keyboard, isn't it? There's like an alt key. So it's like,
yeah, maybe.
Isn't that what the alt-right is supposed to mean? It's like alternative right?
Yeah. I read Kill All Normies a while ago, and there's some continuity between the new right and the
There
alt-right.
is some, but the new right was Reaganism, and the whole point is that they're breaking with Reaganism. I mean, Trump was breaking with Reaganism, and that made the alt-right think that he was breaking in their direction. He was breaking in the direction of the Democrats. He wasn't breaking in the direction. So, I mean, I would say that, again, the socialist branding, I mean, look, now socialism as a currency. So when I came up with this idea originally, socialism, the millennial left was calling themselves socialists. And the old new left, the people I had in mind to get involved in mentoring us in activism, they might have called themselves socialists on the down low or something. But generally, socialism had not really entered. I mean, people called Obama a socialist. But that, it just didn't have the currency that it has now. Whereas now it's kind of like, okay, do you want to be a real socialist? Well, then drop the DSA, join this new thing. I mean, the MAGA communists are doing that, and the neo-Stalinists are doing that. They're like, don't be a socialist, be a communist. Like, they're doing the same thing. It's disenchantment with the failure of Bernie. And I guess now we're going to be dealing with the disenchantment with Biden as a progressive. I mean, I just feel like it's got to be more independent than that. And it's got to be among the people who would be not particularly activated by the capitalist politics as they currently happen, like of either party. I mean, I just think we're intellectuals, so Ashley just dropped off now. But what I want to say is that Ashley and I are from a working class background. But we're intellectuals, we are. And so we're in a different milieu. And that's just the way it is. To be a socialist ideologically means to be an intellectual. And so it is a matter of reaching the working class then. We do become estranged from our background by virtue of being intellectuals. We do. By virtue of being educated, you become estranged from your background. You just do. I mean, that's just it. And it's not good, but it's a reality. And, I think that what we're dealing with now is not ideological, though. It's really more practical and about activism and organizing. It's about trying things, and it's about experimenting. It's also about training ourselves. It is about training ourselves.
I just want to say to the people who are like in the waiting room here on the stream, if they want to join in, send a private chat, because I've found that when I just throw people up on the screen that they don't necessarily want to be on the screen. But any of you who do want to, just send a private chat saying, bring me in, and I will. I will bet you that Ashley dropped off because of some internet thing and not.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm sure that it was a technical thing, right?
Yeah.
And
but okay, let me
go ahead.
Let me ask you something, Chris. So I'm thinking of this almost like being a planning for the proto party, not even like a proto party right off the bat, right? Like we're gonna bring people together to discuss what to do to form a proto party that might become a live socialist party. So it's going to be, intellectual at first, but I do think that it would be worthwhile to read about how to do activist working class politics as a part of the project, and also to have conversations about just this topic of being estranged from the working class. I do feel like that. I don't know. I feel like it's not that difficult to not be estranged from working class people, but
not estranged that way, but estranged politically. Like, in other words, like dealing with people at a human level, no. But in terms of like a political imagination, so there was a term, it was like a Castoriadis term, the social imaginary. It's like an attempt to apply Lacan to society, like the social imaginary, some kind of like, ideological thing that's structuring our view of the world that we're only indirectly aware of, that's really unconscious in character. There's also the political imaginary, or the political imagination. I don't like the term imaginary. I don't want to get Lacanian at all. So I just want to say, like, we don't have to deal with it psychoanalytically at the level of the unconscious. We can deal with it at the level of what is our gut level, right? Just our natural imagination of the way the world works, what society is, what politics is. And I think that it's mostly unformulated, meaning that I think that people have the barest understanding of these things. You know, the 60s generation was concerned with how mass media like colonized the imagination of the working class. That's a real thing. But I also think people don't take it terribly seriously. I agree with Adorno there. The people know that that's not really the way it is. Like, you know, when you watch a Hollywood movie, you know that's not actual social reality. That's not actual political reality. It is a fantasy. But for me, okay, to get to it, you know, I've read the history of the old Socialist Party. And, you know, in the SPD in Germany, there's a book by Lidke called I think it's the Opposition Party, or it's about the counterculture of the SPD. You know, how these parties were parties of total opposition. They were like the Muslim Brotherhood. I always use that example. Like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, right, is a mass civil social organization. It's not particularly working class rooted, but it is rooted among poor people and among middle class people, right? But it's like a cross class thing. And they eventually were elected to power in the Arab Spring, right? And it didn't work out well. They basically were drawn out into the open by the military, and then they were massacred. I mean, basically, they were like, I don't know if you heard about this, Doug. They like tried people, like hundreds of people at a time, and sentenced them to death and executed them. It's like, holy shit, right? Like that's what getting elected might do if you're not ready, right? Obviously, that happened in Chile, right, with Allende. Like they weren't ready to really have the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they paid the price. And not just Allende, but the followers, the people paid the price, right? So we need to think about the way people used to organize, the way they did establish a counterculture, a working class counterculture, right? And it is a little bit quasi-religious. Like the sociologists of the time denounced the socialists as being the church of the working class. The Communist parties up until recently, so I don't know, Ashley, I don't know how much this is still the case in Greece. I know that up until recently it was the case in Italy, that there was like a communist party and it had like a working class base and even some middle class followers, and they had like their own like kind of subculture. They had their own sort of oppositional culture, right? And, you know, we do need to get back to that. We do, right? And then the question is, well, what are the terms of that culture? Well, civil liberties, you know, the value of work, dignity of labor, you know, like, but they were, you know, it's kind of like, it's like the stuff on the stream that you guys were just having immediately went to like sexuality, gender stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know what? Maybe none of that should be the law.
Listen, we got 3 people here that just joined the stream, Eli, Will, and Wendy, and they all 3 said they wanted to say something. I'm going to start with Eli, go to Will, then to Wendy. So Eli, go ahead.
All right. So this is back in the conversation a bit from when we were talking about, you know, what would be another word we could use. And I actually wanted to push and challenge and say, you know, why not try to appropriate the word libertarian? Because, you know, for a couple of reasons, you know, one, it's sitting out there and the Libertarian Party are not very organized about keeping hold of it. But also because I know this is probably specific to the United States, but in my experience socially of my more working class friends, I've had a lot easier of a time converting convinced libertarians into one or another variety of libertarian socialist and turning them onto that than I have ever had convincing like all the aspiring socialist intellectuals with, you know, hammer and sickle pins that civil liberty or civil society in the real sense has any value whatsoever.
That's a fantastic point. I mean, that's exactly it. And also like socialism, as I was trying to say, that word has become poisoned with everything that is unfreedom. Whereas libertarian, at least as something that you put as a modifier, that's why I call myself a libertarian communist, although that's also poisoned to a certain extent as well. But at least then it kind of, first of all, it gets people's attention. But second of all, it actually does speak to a sense of coming from. Oh, my internet is shit. A sense of where you are coming from in that you are pushing through and sublating that liberal tradition.
I would, there's an old term, like this is something that more familiar to me and Doug's generation. Libertarian socialism or libertarian communism, right? So there was this idea of like libertarian socialism or libertarian communism as opposed
That's why I
to
said it's been poisoned.
right?
Yeah, everyone was going through a Bookchinist wave before they went through a Stalinist wave, and I don't know what happened to the Bookchinism.
No, I mean,
It was just uncool.
Bookchin used to annoy me, and I became more sympathetic, actually. And because anarchists do annoy me. And but at the same time, I think that what would need to be done at first would be very much anarchisty libertarian. It would be, and the bootstrap problem, right? So when you say the bootstrap problem, that's no mere problem. That's also ideologically tainted with neoliberalism. But I mean, if we're living in this horrible social Darwinist struggle to survive world, probably the activist working class people are going to be the survivors. They're going to be the thrivers. They're going to be the go-getters, the hustlers. I mean, we're going to be competing with religion and gangs. That's who we're going to be competing with. We're not going to be competing with academics.
I think the Democratic Party.
Well, certainly the Democratic Party. But I think I told you this, Doug, that when I was getting my PhD, the dissertation chair, Ken Warren, a friend of Adolph Fried, African-American literary historian, he said, Chris, you're probably my last working class student that I'll have at the PhD level because it's just too expensive for working class people to get a PhD. They're not going to make it to this point. They're not going to make it through the undergraduate institutions needed to get into a PhD program. They're not really going to be able to do a PhD program. And so, he basically considered me the last of the Mohicans, an artifact of when the working class tried to be educated. So academia is just nothing. It's gone. Like that's just, you guys are talking about anti-intellectualism.
No, so what would be really, I come from the other end of not the complete other end of the class spectrum, but definitely the other end of the class spectrum regarding academia, where like I've had educated family for several generations now. I'm like the second or third in my family to do a PhD. What I would actually say is one of the immense uses of a working class organization that would be really productive would actually be to like give downwardly mobile professional types something to go into that is properly working class and not this mishmash of like petty bourgeois radical Democrat with Stalinist with anarchist. Sorry, I'm thinking of an incident in my graduate student union I helped organize where like I got a stream full of invective.
I meant to try to interrupt you earlier because I wanted to get Wendy. Wendy was waiting to say something already, so I want to get Wendy's comment in. But then we'll come back to that. But Wendy?
Okay, well, I was actually coming at something very similar, the same point that you've all been talking about. When Chris was talking about civil liberties, I just wanted to say, in talking to people who are not already into this sort of thing, I think that's the way to go. I think that's the thing. That's the thing people don't understand Marxism is about, number one, that is integral and core. And number two, it's the thing people are thinking about, at least some of them. So that was all for now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I like to hear that. I like to hear that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The problem with the libertarian is that, instead of being warped by like Maoism, they're warped by Ayn Rand or something. I mean, maybe that's over. Hopefully that's over. But,
sure, but didn't Ralph Leonard say egoism is the gateway to communism?
Maybe.
No, so I'm a little serious about that. Like, I don't like Ayn Rand either. I've always been, the PMC who doesn't like Ayn Rand and likes Elizabeth Warren instead. Sure, yeah, but like, there's something to be said for telling people, look, if you manage to translate the value of your labor into personal possessions, then someone does not get to come and take your toothbrush or your house. Like, I remember
man,
being taught the
true.
theory personal possessions versus private property. And then
Yeah.
when we actually have
Basic.
socialist groups, we throw it out instantly and say that we're going to redistribute your apartment and your toothbrush.
Yep. Yep. No, it's sad. I mean, so a lot of the culture war stuff, it's like we experienced this, Doug, at the RNC.
Mhm.
So when you were at the Never Trumper gathering, it was with the kids at a bar, and then these Trumpies came in, right? And they were like, gay people know how to have a good time, right? And so, you know what I mean? But it was just like, yeah, maybe we don't want like our kids educated on like homosexuality starting at age 5, but adults, right? So that's like the new language. And again, it's kind of like the Democrats will make you feel like, oh, they're just saying that. No, I think they really believe that adults should be free to modify their bodies and have whatever sexual practices or gender identity, but let the kids be kids, let them have their childhood. And I'm not saying that that's not loaded with ideology, it is. But I am saying, okay, right? Like, do we really have to like push the backlash, right? So the culture wars, so when I say a subculture, I feel like the culture could be very neutral and just be like, again, like religion, compassionate, right? Compassionate, welcoming, like forgiving, right? Rather than, and it's not like we just got to get past this, like, well, I don't need to be forgiven for my homosexuality or something. No, I don't. But but if someone has a kind of tolerant attitude, that's fine. I don't need like, I think I've talked to you about this on the podcast before, Doug. It's like pro-gay straight people. It's like, what? Why? Like, you know what I mean? Like celebrating me because I'm gay? No, like that's not necessary. And it might even be a little creepy. It might be a little bit like, are you compensating for your homophobia? Are you like forcing yourself to like gay people or something?
I'm gonna do a typical straight guy thing and say, I have a gay friend other than you, Chris. And one of the first complaints I ever heard from him was that he said that he hates when his straight friends introduce him to people as their gay friend.
Oh,
there's
fuck
my
no,
gay
yeah.
friend.
No, fuck
People do that. Oh, how
Yeah.
embarrassing.
Right? And so it's just one of these things where I don't think that these culture war issues divide the working class the way they divide the middle class or the educated classes, so to speak, or the PMC. Obviously the PMC, because they get very attached at a micro level to the policies that they favor. Like they get extremely enthusiastic or enraged about minute policy differences. That like, oh, if you say it this way instead of that way, you're a fascist.
But in the
Right.
just
It's like
to push back on that a little bit, I'm watching, Kamala come up and organize white dudes for Kamala and black dudes for Kamala and white women for Kamala and do these Zoom calls and raise millions of
the
dollars.
Democrats have a base that's called rich people, and rich people come in all colors and sexualities and genders.
Yeah, but at the same time,
right.
He's narrowing the gap in Wisconsin and in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. And I don't know
Narrowing the gap. Yeah. Among the people that they were able to reach, people who take a phone call to answer. A working class person is not going to take a phone call to talk about the election. They're too busy.
They might not vote either.
It's just going to be a nail biter, Doug. We might as well prepare ourselves. Like the thing is, we're just, this is going to be a quasi underground venture.
Right.
In other words, it's going to be a public venture because communists disdain to hide their views. Communist Manifesto, right? But it's not going to be about trying to win in the capitalist public sphere. It isn't. It's going to be niche, of course. Like even if it's hopefully less niche than the millennial left was, it's still going to be pretty niche. MAGA communism is quite niche. Like these things are niche, right? And I feel like, how do we reach the working class? How do we we have to learn how to. Right? It's a go to the people moment. I was going to say that about the old SDS, early 60s. They had their go to the people moment, and they did, and they actually did reach people. And then they sort of abandoned that and went haywire with the Weather Underground and Maoism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I feel like, well, no, it is like a neurotic moment. We are disaffected intellectuals, and we are trying to reach the people, and we have to experiment with that. We have to try, meaning, and also not reinvent the wheel entirely. So I mentioned the wasteland as a field of opportunity, but not entirely reinvent the wheel, and maybe do things that are on the fringes of existing NGO activities. But the thing is, the NGO world, they do community organizing, but it's very thin. It doesn't reach down really into the working class. It might reach poor people, but again, like working class people, like there's this whole layer of people that just don't factor in. There are the sort of wards of the state poor people, and then there are the middle class people who have enough free time to do their civic duty and join some activist NGO type operations. And we're in that latter category, probably, at first. And it is about cadre building. So I wanted to say something about that, about the democratic integration versus total integration. I mean, yes, so the total integration party is the party of like fascism and Stalinism and, so-called Bolshevism. But actually the old SPD and the old SPA also was a kind of total integration party, meaning people had their whole social lives taken over by socialist organized activities, socialist sports clubs, socialist book clubs, socialist, drinking clubs, socialist teetotaler prohibition clubs, socialist music ensembles. In other words, people went to work and they spent their off work time with their friends at the socialist pub, owned by socialists, right? And patroned by working class people who were socialists. I mean, it was like very, very, very much like a religious culture, like a church. It was, right? And that freaked people out at the time. Like a lot of bourgeois sociology, they were like, oh, this is some kind of like medieval corporatism. This is some kind of like regressive collectivism. Well, what's the alternative, really? Right? But again, we also live in a strange time when like working class is an identity or something, in the same way of like protected classes in the technocratic managerial sense. Well, no, there is a working class identity, but it wouldn't be as wards of the state. It wouldn't be as like a protected class. Like classism, like you have to fight against racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. You have to fight against classism. It's like, no, not like that, right? It's not about tokenization or being a protected class of people, being a ward of the state. It is about a positive identity of like, who are the people? The people are the workers. We're the workers, like that kind of identity, which I think can work. I think that people still have that. I mean, in the United States, it's strange, but I think it's not entirely foreign to the United States. So in the United States, everybody who's not rich or poor is middle class. I think in other countries, there is more of a sense of being part of the working class, as opposed to being part of the owning class or the professional class. I think there is more of a sense of that. There isn't this kind of murky middle class idea. But I don't think that's really an obstacle either.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we should think of the fact that there's a big conception of the middle class, not necessarily a big strata of actually economically middle class people, as reflecting a kind of social equity that doesn't exist in other parts of the world, and that we should play to that notion of social equity. And not to say that people who are working class can't differentiate themselves on that basis from middle class people.
Sure,
They do.
sure. Yeah,
But the middle class can't differentiate itself from the working class on that basis. Not honestly. And
I mean, even the Democrats have their working families idea. They're like, we're the party of working families. And obviously Trump has been trying to compete with that, and now Vance, right? Where, you know, it is much more of a working class as opposed to middle class appeal, right? Because I think that previously, like in most of our lifetime, the parties competed over a middle class appeal. Whereas now, I think both parties do have a kind of working class pitch. Eli?
Yeah, so surprisingly, this goes to a bunch of discussions I had with my dad over the weekend when he came to visit. He's a full-on boomer, you know, born 47, so he would have been 21 years old in 68, and, you know, raised me as a bit of a red diaper baby. But, you know, the thing being, I feel like the left, you know, including Platypus, including the socialist left, like, we do need to deal with the fact that the middle class is a large percent of the population. Like, this was the argument I had with my dad, was that he was saying, you know, surely everyone, you know, if you add up everyone who is dependent on labor-based income for a living, then surely that's like 90-something% of the population, he says. And then my counter was, okay, but if you add up the people who don't have any kind of assets, like don't have any assets, right? No equity, no 401k, no IRA, no house, nor like no mortgaged house, none of it. And of course, you know, part of neoliberalism has been to like spread these things more widely. But if you add up the people who have absolutely zero of that and are a pure proletarian in the 19th century sense, that's a lot smaller than 90% of the population.
That might actually be a minority.
Yeah, that's probably a minority constituency at this point.
But that doesn't have to be the definition here. So it's not just
like I was saying to my dad, I agree that that doesn't have to be our normative definition. But if we keep trying to pretend that that's the subject we're organizing, and that we can organize today's working class as if it was a 19th century proletariat, you know, basically living in these like industrial dormitories and owning nothing, then we'll fail, because most workers today don't live like that. So we do need a theory of the middle class,
about this,
productive one,
which
not
is
just they're bad.
This, like the old workers movement, right? So Doug and I in the podcast have talked about the NLRB and about the kind of statification of the working class through these mechanisms. And in other countries, it's much more via political parties as well as the state. In the United States, it's a little bit looser. But actually, like, strike actions were made possible by economic support from the broader working class, meaning workers who weren't particularly well off were helped by workers who had more and who could pitch in and contribute. I mean, that's why it's like religion. It is like religion. And also, like, even, look, there are going to be small business owners and professionals who are going to be socialists, right? So also
that's even in the Communist Manifesto, by the way.
Of course, it's right
even
there.
In the Communist Manifesto.
It's absolutely right there. And you know, who are going to maybe contribute money, who are maybe going to contribute volunteer labor, right? And that's just necessary, right? Socialist politics is going to be bourgeois politics in that sense, right? And so again, it's not like, okay, bourgeois politics is a class thing. No, it's about the historical destiny of these classes, meaning the historical destiny of the working class is to transform capitalism into socialism. the historical destiny of the capitalist class is to destroy society through the decadence of capitalism, right? And not because they want to, but everything that they do does that, right? Even when they don't want it to.
Wendy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, my semi-random thoughts. I think in terms of organizing, I would want to organize anyone who's interested, regardless. But secondly, strategically, obviously, some groups actually have power to stop capitalism, but that's a little bit of a separate issue. And what groups can be useful to do things will come clear if we can see who is in fact interested. Truckers can stop things. That they're one group for saying, but yeah. So I think they're two different issues. So we don't really have to decide who to organize because it's just a question of anyone to start with. Ourselves, myself, my very.
It is about ourselves. It is about ourselves. Meaning, Doug and I were talking about this around the RNC. Because we had some. We have some kind of lefty intellectuals around us in mind. And it's like, well, actually, intellectuals need a project to discipline them so that they don't end up going down a rabbit hole of navel-gazing with their own ideas. They do need contact with reality. I've been disciplined by platypus for the last 20 years. And that's helped me as an intellectual. It's been very clarifying. And imagine how much more clarifying it would be if I was disciplined by a working class movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that would put me in touch with social reality. This wasteland, the open field of opportunity, is also totally unexplored. It's terra incognita. Like, we don't really know the nature of social reality in any coherent way, because it's only been studied in a very limited way. Ashley, this from sociology. Like, it's like, do we even know the world that we're living in, actually? And I think that a activist movement would make us explore and figure out what's the concrete nature of capitalism, what's the concrete condition that the working class is actually living in now.
Yeah, and that can happen through organizing too.
Yes.
As people get involved. I'm trying to learn. Do you guys know Anwar Sheikh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been trying to learn about capitalism from him. I haven't got very far yet, but yeah, it's good stuff.
But
does Kuchlook want to join the? Kuchlook, did you want to say anything?
I'm not sure I have anything very smart to say, but I can try.
That's my situation every week, but go ahead.
I would say this. I'm really on Wendy's wavelength here. All over the world, over the last 15 or so years, there have been gigantic protest movements that have taken millions and millions of people and put them on the streets. And the thing that put them on the streets are basic everyday needs, whether that's food, bread, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that something that is to be built will be built out of them. And this is a huge, I can't even just, if you've ever been inside it, it's so gigantic, it's indescribable. So that's the huge humanity. And I don't know what you do. I'm not going to pretend that I have the 10,000 IQ to figure out how you become that or engender that or ride that to something or create that. I have no idea, but I think that's the thing.
What I've been working on for the last 20 years is this kind of negative approach to the left. And what has that meant? Well, protest demos. So first of all, the left as a culture became the culture of protest demos. But then also there's a deeper history in terms of mass demonstrations. Petty bourgeois democracy. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean like proprietors or professionals on the street. It means that the horizon of politics, so it's masses of people, it's workers, it's lumpens, it's whatever, peasants, but the horizon of politics is petty bourgeois democracy, meaning what do they want, right? They want a more accountable government They want a more responsive state. They want politics that's more accountable, more responsible. And it's very inchoate, and it can be taken advantage by anyone, right? It really is the basis of Bonapartism. And the point is that capitalist politics today is already in large measure that, meaning they are able to, even without much effort, take advantage of mass protest movements that really have very little to do with what they're offering. You know, it's like, what's the relationship between BLM and the Democratic Party? On the one hand, they're totally connected. On the other hand, they have no connection whatsoever.
I would like to say that this seems, I agree entirely, first of all, they're very easy to capture. They're often captured. I don't think that they're the same thing. I agree that they're inchoate, but I would also say that to some level, the way that they're captured is to obscure their original motivations.
Yes.
And their original motivations are very much material, like entirely material motivations.
Yes.
And they're composed of regular people. So it's like, how do you, again, like I said before, I don't have the 8,000 IQ to figure out how you shape it into something or is shaped by it. I don't know. But I think that's somehow the key.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that, again, it's got to come from those people. But there also has to be some kind of groundwork done. There has to be some kind of framework that feeds it into a more long-term project. Because it is going to take a while to build a socialist party. It's not going to be like these populist parties that emerge, you know, like, I don't know, the Brexit Party, or what are the UK Independence Party, or what are they, the Reform Party now? What's Nigel Farage, right? There are these like bubbles, right? You know, Ross Perot's Reform Party, right? So there are discontents that can form like a kind of bubble type political formation. I mean, the reason it's going to take a while to make an actual socialist party is not because it's so very hard, but because actually it's going to take a while for the working class itself to learn how to organize itself and build up its own institutions such that it can actually make real changes in society. That's why it's going to take a long time. It's because, you know, working class doesn't have that now. Right, so it has the ability to go out on the streets, riot, but it doesn't have something more long-term that could actually, I mean, you know, I'm a Marxist, I'm a Leninist even. What does that mean? It means that I think that the working class has to build up institutions that can replace the state. I think, and it's going to just take a little while to build those up. You know, it's not going to take forever, but it's going to take a little while. It's not something that, you know, you have. So, you know, how do you avoid capture? Well, you have to be doing something else.
Wendy?
We've got some good resources now in the form of the internet and that kind of thing. And also in some countries, at least, a lot of, well, affluence and health, relatively speaking. So we've got to make sure that we don't completely lose control of it. The internet, that is, as could happen. I never know how seriously to take it, but it's a bit worrying what's happening with the internet and surveillance and censorship and so on.
We might have missed our opportunity with the internet.
Well, I think we can't. I was speaking to someone who's thought about this a lot, and he's older than me, and said we're going to win the censorship war and lose the surveillance war. So I have to think about that.
Well, you know why? So there's a very simple reason why that's the case. It's because often the government wants extreme views expressed so that they can surveil them.
Yeah, so we've got to think about that, about how does one live in a society in which one is, and organize in a society in which one is surveilled, and maybe can't spread a message either. But I can't remember how I got onto that. Oh, it's because you were saying build up
resources. Yeah.
So we've got good things. A lot of good things have happened.
There's infrastructure. You know, basic infrastructure, meaning the working class didn't have to pave the roads.
Yeah.
Right? Although I guess in some places they actually did. So we were in Milwaukee, Doug, and it did take a socialist mayor of Milwaukee in the early 20th century to actually build the infrastructure. Right?
Yeah, and I think they hasn't been rebuilt since.
I know. Well, that's the problem, right? That's the problem, right? So, but making a joke there, but there is an existing capitalist infrastructure, and we have to use it. But we also have to understand that it belongs to them. The internet belongs to the capitalists, of course it does.
That's kind of the point, isn't it? That's
yeah, but it belongs to them, and I'm glad it belongs to Elon Musk, and I'm glad it's not been turned into a government utility like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren wanted. Right?
Yeah.
Because at least something can get through with Elon for a second until he changes his mind about whatever.
Yeah.
I
think what do you think about net neutrality, though, as something to champion, Chris? I mean, it's old.
I don't understand it well enough. I
net
think
neutrality, net neutrality has more to do with how the world, like globally, internationally, right? And so it has to do with the fact that the infrastructure started in the U.S. and the U.S. had to sort of, reassure the other countries that even though the basic infrastructure was here, it wasn't going to be used for foreign policy of the United States. That's what net neutrality that's what it originally meant, right?
Okay, but
And
when it was championed by the left, it meant corporations have to, if I create a website on a corporate platform, the corporations can't throttle the speed in which my website is sent to someone's computer as opposed to...
there are things like that too. That's right. There are things like that. Like that's, I guess, close to a public utility function then, right?
Mm-hmm. But it's not. That's not saying, oh, the government will own Facebook or
no,
Twitter.
right?
It's
It's regulation.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why. I mean, I think that I've talked about that with you on the podcast in the past as well, which is the progressive era.
Mm-hmm.
The two souls of the progressive era. So one was break up the monopolies, and the other was don't break them up but regulate them. And actually, the socialists were closer to the latter than the former. So the Democrats wanted to break up the monopolies, and the Republicans wanted to regulate them. And in many respects, this is the Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson era.
Mm-hmm.
The socialists were actually closer to Teddy Roosevelt than they were to Woodrow Wilson, because they saw breaking up the monopolies as regressive, whereas they saw government regulation of the monopolies as necessary, like meaning the capitalists themselves saw the necessity of it. Historical necessity, but still treacherous, right? So, again, the party of total opposition, I mean, this is what's going to seem very strange. So they would have favored regulation over breaking up. But when they had parliamentary representatives, they voted no on everything. Pretty much everything, right? And they did that for propagandistic purposes, but also on principle. And so it was the party of total opposition, including they voted against the welfare state. Right? They abstained on things like, raising the tax rate on the capitalists. They abstained, meaning they were like, okay, we're going to take ourselves out of the equation because the working class, is neutral as regards whether the capitalist class wants to tax itself more to fund their government. Right? It was very clear. It's their government. It's their state. It's their welfare state. So, Bismarck pioneered the welfare state. The SPD voted against it all the time. All the time. Right? And in terms of funding it, they voted against the working class funding it. Meaning they were like, well, if the capitalists want to set up a welfare program for the workers, go at it. But the workers are not going to be suckered into paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In other words, socialists were against taxes. I mean, that's where you're getting into this libertarian zone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, well, if they really want to do these wars, if they really want to go to Mars, let them pay for it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
If they want to do like an infrastructure project, to benefit their business, let them pay for it. Like, don't pay us and then tax us to pay for their stuff.
Right.
Right? Because that's the big con. And I mean, this is a hard one, but again, this would be immediately to distinguish ourselves from the progressives. Because the progressives have this idea of like, well, it's a democracy, and so if everybody benefits, then everyone should pay for it. And yeah, the rich people should pay more, but the workers should have a stake. Everyone's a stakeholder. No, the working class are not stakeholders. Even when they are, they understand that they're stakeholders in someone else's thing. Right? Meaning if the capitalists want to give me an opportunity to have my savings earn more interest, then I might give them some money, put it in a bank. So socialists set up their own banks.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be hard to do now, but not entirely. There are still credit unions, right? My husband works for a auditing firm, but he works on a specific client, and it is the teachers' credit union, which is now a major capitalist fund, right? A major investment fund in global capitalism. It's huge, right? But it still is basically based on a credit union for workers who can get better interest rates than they can from other commercial banks, right? So it's these things are all like connected up. I mean, that's why when Eli said, well, if you don't have a mortgage, if you don't have a 401k, I don't, like, again, those are things that the capitalists use to exploit the working class. A 401k, even a pension fund, which is not a 401k, even the Social Security fund that we pay into in our taxes is another way that they exploit the working class. So that's just inevitable, and it shouldn't be. I mean, yes, people are convinced that this is their equity, this is their asset, this is something or other. No, it's just a way that it's a wage. It's a part of the wage system, in fact. Right. So we have to sort of demystify these things and, just understand their real purpose, but also understand the goal. I think that that's the other thing. So a lot of the activism that needs to be done is basically liberal in character. The only thing that would distinguish it as socialist is the goal. Right.
Listen, we're about 12 minutes over our usual time.
Cool.
But I want to give everyone who's on the chat here, or like Eli, Kushlook, Wendy, a chance to say anything more, if you have anything more to add before we go.
Okay. Well, I'll be working on the Australian branch of the Proto Party. Nice to meet you all. I've been watching you for a while. Learned a lot, and I don't know. I'll just follow, see what happens. Wait for the app.
All right. Yeah, it's coming soon.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, Wendy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm gonna leave it there. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. See you next week.
Right.
See you, Ashley. See you, Doug.
Bye-bye.
In the
Bye.
case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets